What's your thoughts on government cover-ups or covert societies attempting to control humanity? Do you believe in ancient astronauts, intergalactic communication, or extraterrestrial visitations? Ever had an experience with disembodied spirits or the paranormal universe? Are these subjects fact or fiction? Each week, Tony and Eddie explore these unbelievable realities and beyond. Exclusively on Truth Be Told.
Hello, and welcome back to Truth Be Told, where we believe an experience becomes truth. I'm your host, Tony Sweet, and joining me now in studio, world-renowned psychic, Eddie Connor, and our wonderful co-host, Walt Lusk.
Hey, thanks, Tony. You know, we're proud to call Earth Friendly Products our sponsor, and for over 40 years, Earth Friendly Products have brought you the greenest home merchandise for all of your family needs. You can learn more at ecos.com. That's ECOS.com.
And take your mind on a literary journey right over to adventuresunlimitedpress.com to purchase books from our famed experts featured right here on Truth Be Told.
Today we have author and bioanthropologist Rachel Wentz in the fascinating book that she wrote, Life and Death at Windover. She shares her findings about the 7,000-year-old archaeological site in Titusville, Florida.
You know, Rachel graduated from Florida State University with a PhD in anthropology and specializes in the analysis of human remains. She has even investigated prehistoric sites in Florida, such as Little Salt Springs and Calico Hill.
Along with her Windover publication, Rachel has also authored Chasing Bones, The Mass of Men, and Let Burn. Please welcome our esteemed guest and new friend here to Truth Be Told, Rachel Wentz.
Rachel, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you so much for having me.
The crowd loves you already, so we're in good shape.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, first of all, Dr. Wentz, I want to say I'm honored to have you on the show. I've been researching a lot of your books and YouTube clips, and you've done so much in your lifetime. And I first recognized your career in American Unearthed when you when they were talking about Windover, the archaeological site in Titusville. And I was so fascinated because I'm a big history buff, and I don't remember ever learning about this site before. And I want to know, why do you think this site is not well known throughout the country? This should be one of the biggest discoveries pretty much in American history.
And talked about.
Well, that was one of the reasons I wrote the book, because a lot of people still don't know about the Windover site. And I think one of the reasons it was discovered back in 1980. To get the word out, and a lot of the research that's been done on the Windover site has been done within academic circles. You know, there have been many master theses and dissertations done on the skeletons from Windover, which my research has focused on, but a lot of that has stayed within professional journals. So I felt, really compelled to write a book that would tell the general public about this site, because it is one of the most important archaeological sites from North America.
Yeah, and that's what I found fascinating, is because there was, I think, 168 bodies found.
Yes.
And could you tell us, and for the people out there that don't know about this site, it was in the 80s, but how was it discovered? I found that fascinating.
Well, yeah, there's so many fascinating aspects to the Windover site. It was discovered in 1982 during the construction of a housing project that was going to be called Windover Farms.
Oh.
And this slot of land is located right in Titusville, Florida, which is just near Cape Kennedy, Cape Canaveral, just north of there. And so they were demucking a small pond. A backhoe operator named Steve Vanderjack was kind of lifting the muck out of the base of this pond when he noticed something kind of shining on the spoil pile. And he climbed down from his machine, and when he picked up what he thought was a big stone, he turned it over and realized it was a human skull. And that kind of put in motion all of the events that led to the eventual excavation of this small pond. And this pond turned out to be what we call a mortuary pond, meaning it was a small natural body of water, but it was actually used as a cemetery. And they sent off a couple of fragments of bone to see just how ancient the cemetery was, because they could tell by aspects of the skeletons, like the heavy wearing down of the teeth and the shape of the skulls, that it was probably Native Americans, probably prehistoric. But when they got the radiocarbon dates back, they were just astounded to find that the skeletons coming out of that pond were over 7,000 years old.
Wow.
So, the antiquity of the site makes it truly significant, because to find skeletons that are well preserved that old in North America is very difficult. And so a few years later, the excavations ensued. They excavated over 3 years, and like you said, they ended up excavating 168 people out of the base of this small pond. And so for almost 1,000 years, Native Americans here ago, for some reason, chose to bury their dead in the base of this pond.
Now, what I've also found fascinating is, and you can probably explain this better than anybody, is the preservation or preserve of the bodies were amazing compared to many other sites.
7,000 years ago.
Because there was brain matter was still there.
Oh, wow.
The food in the. Could you explain why there was it preserved so well, these bodies?
Sure. In the archaeological record, the preservation is really determined by the kind of the environment in which the skeletons are placed. And because Native Americans chose to place these skeletons in the base of a pond, fortunately for archaeologists thousands of years later, it afforded the perfect preservation environment for hard tissue, because the base of the pond, these individuals were placed down in the muck of the pond, so it was an anaerobic environment. It lacked oxygen, so you didn't have the normal kind of degradative processes that eat away at skeletons. That little pond happened to be of a neutral pH. If it had been acidic, it would have eaten away all of the skeletal elements. But because it was neutral, it preserved them. And even, like you said, within some of the really well-preserved skulls, we had brain matter intact.
That's
over
amazing.
7,000 years. So it was just a really fortuitous kind of event that these skeletons were placed in this mucky pond, and it was thanks to that mucky pond that they were preserved for so long. If these skeletons had been buried in the sand of Florida, they would have eroded thousands of years ago. They wouldn't have lasted probably 100 years, because the soils in Florida, are such acidic sands. And so, we have this beautifully preserved population that dates back so long, and it's all because they were buried within the pond.
Sounds pretty smart.
Yeah.
Well, I doubt the Native Americans were thinking of preservation thousands of years
right.
in the future. We don't know, we really don't know why they chose the pond. The unique thing about Florida is the Windover site is not alone. It's one of 5 mortuary ponds that have been discovered in the state, and they all date to about the same time period. So for some reason, around this time period, Native Americans were choosing to inter their dead within ponds, and I'm sure there are many more ponds out there that we haven't discovered. But then it seems they kind of transformed into different types of burial practices. They started using large cemeteries within the ground, and then they started using shell mounds, and then earthen mounds, and then, up until historic period times. But so we don't know what significance the pond held.
Do you think, Dr. Wentz, that there's a possibility that the Native Americans may have added something into the pond? Or is it even possible that when 7,000 years ago, maybe it wasn't as much a pond as we think of it today? Could it have been like more of a bog, or kind of like quicksand-ish or something like that?
Well, that was one of the primary research questions that the excavators who excavated the site, back in the 80s wanted to answer. And the excavations were led by Dr. Glenn Doran from Florida State University and Dr. Dave Dickel, who is also a skeletal biologist. So they worked in concert to excavate this site. And one of the questions they had was, well, was this originally just a plain earthen cemetery that was inundated with a pond? So what they did was they took core samples from the periphery of the pond to determine, how this pond came to be. And what they found was that the pond is actually 10,000 years old.
Wow.
So this was a body of water when the Native Americans chose to bury in it. And we have other evidence that it was a pond as well, because not only were the dead kind of put in fetal positions and placed down in the muck, but many of them, over half of them, had small erections of sticks placed over the body to kind of anchor them to the base of the pond.
That's what I was going to ask.
So we know that the peat that they were interred in started building up about 10,000 years ago, and that this was a permanent pond. It wasn't some ephemeral, body of water that kind of came and went.
Were the ponds, the other 4 ponds that were found so far, were they nearby this particular one, or were they more spread out?
No, actually, the other ponds are located in central and kind of southwest Florida, and 2 of them are natural springs. Warm mineral springs and little salt springs are not actually ponds, they're springs. But the problem we have with the other 4 sites is that Windover is the only one of these 5 ponds that has been professionally, systematically excavated. All the other ponds, the 2 springs, Warm Mineral Springs and Little Salt Springs, were kind of collected by novice archaeologists that weren't actually trained archaeologists. They kind of collected a lot of the skeletal material from the base of those springs. So we really have no provenience. We don't know how the skeletons in those situations were arranged, who was, kind of buried next to whom. So there are a lot more questions that we have about these other sites. And the other 2 sites in Central Florida were just salvage excavations, meaning they were discovered as the site was being torn up for construction. And they allowed some volunteers and some archaeologists to come through and work through the spoil piles, but we don't have anything like we have from Windover, showing how these people were actually buried.
Well, another question that I know your team has already answered, but I'm really curious. 2 things. Number one is there's a lot of varmints in Florida. And so alligators and crocodiles and snakes and reptiles have been around for hundreds and thousands of years. What is it about this particular burial pond, do you think, that
avoided all that?
Yeah, that kept the alligators and the varmints out of it?
Well, for one, it was a fairly small pond, so there probably wasn't, a large population of alligators in it. They did find some skeletal elements from turtle, and I think they did find some alligator remnants. But the thing is, when these individuals were interred in the base of the pond, they were kind of forced down into the muck. And then, like I said, a majority of them had a little teepee of sticks built over them, which not only kept them anchored in the pond, but also protected them from that type of carnivore damage. Because there are 10,000 individual bones that make up the skeletal population, and only 6 of them showed any type of carnivore damage. So they were really incredibly well preserved and protected from that type of damage.
Oh, that's fascinating. And also, I know they found this pond originally because they were building what did you say, condos or something over there?
Housing.
It was going to be a housing development, which it is today. It is a housing development. The houses did spring up around the site. Fortunately, the owner of the plot of land graciously donated the pond, the surrounding lot, to a preservation organization, so it is protected. And, of course, it's protected by law today.
Oh, good. Well, then I would send them all DVDs of Poltergeist.
Well, there was some questions of, people who moved in afterwards were kind of astounded to find that, wow, this 7,000-year-old cemetery was located right in their neighborhood. But I think they've embraced it. I mean, we haven't had any problems with people being scared off. So.
Well, given the significance of this find, and obviously it didn't go viral because we didn't have the capacity to do it back then, I'm assuming that there's been a lot of skepticism and non-promotion of this find since.
Well, not exactly non-promotion. You know, we want to respect these sites. I mean, these were cemeteries, so we treat them with great respect. These are someone's relatives, so we treat the skeletons with great respect. So it's not the type of site that you want to go around and advertise.
Right.
At the time of the excavations, of course, they drew worldwide attention because it was such an astounding site and it was such unusual circumstances. So there was a lot of media attention at the time during the 3 field seasons. But again, most of the information we've gleaned from the Windover skeletons has been kind of channeled into the academic literature, which the public really just doesn't have access to. There have been some documentaries done, some very good ones, even some fairly recent. And back in 2001, there was a British documentary called, I think, The Bog People. And it was very well done. And it interviewed Dr. Glenn Doran, who was, like I said, the lead excavator of the site from Florida State University. And, but, you know, you have to kind of walk that fine line of respect and you know, not sensationalizing something like this.
Well, don't you find it fascinating? I'm from the southeastern United States. I grew up in North Carolina and lived there 35 years before I moved out to La La Land. And what I'm finding a lot through the 20 years I've lived here now is you're just, you know, you'll scroll AOL News or you'll pick up a newspaper and it's like, there was somebody digging a pond in their backyard in Tennessee and found a dinosaur. And but the southeastern United States, it seems like more and more often we're starting to see things like this. What do you relate that to, if anything at all, Dr. Wentz?
Well, you know, everything is tied to the history of the landscape. And, you know, Florida may have these incredibly ancient burial sites, but then again, we don't have dinosaurs in Florida because at the time Florida was submerged. So, you know, every piece of topography within North America is different depending on the history of that landscape. Just like we have great dinosaur finds out west, it's because there were dinosaurs out there, and we have great preservation out in those really arid deserts that allow those fossils to preserve. So, you know, it really depends. There are so many factors that come into play when we're talking about fossilized remains or, you know, the remnants of past populations.
Well, I have a really important question for you. This is serious. Are you ready?
I'm ready. I'm scared, but I'm
ready. Don't be scared. So, have you been to see Jurassic World yet? And if you have, were you able to enjoy it because of your immense knowledge about fossils and that sort of thing?
Actually, you know, I did go see it. I just went and saw it Monday. I couldn't resist because, you know, long before I had an interest in archaeology, I grew up a dinosaur freak. So, you know, Jurassic Park, I have seen that dozens and dozens of times. And, you know, although the science is a little questionable and not exactly realistic, those things are wonderful because they get people thinking about the past and thinking in terms of what our Earth has been like over the eons, because it's gone through so many different radical transformations that, you know, I think movies like that, even when they're not based solely in reality, that they can still be a tremendous amount of fun.
I think so too. It was fun to watch it, and it was also fun to watch the kids. First of all, there were dinosaurs that had better manners than the people on my right, but that's okay. It's called. Yep, I have free will, so I marched my little popcorn and my soda 3 more rows down, and I still enjoyed the movie. Was a little upset.
Yeah, it was fun. I think it was a little dino overload by the end of the movie. I was kind of super saturated with dinosaurs, but it was a lot of fun.
It was Jurassic. Come on.
Yeah.
One thing that what you were talking about is, you know, it brought a history to people's attention and really starts making people think. And that's what I love about history, of just the unknown and where we can take this and what mysteries lie beneath most of our feet. And when this was found, do we know what tribe, because you said this is Native American, do we know what tribe that this site is from?
You know, we have no idea. And the problem we have with Florida is we don't have a lot of cultural continuity going back thousands of years. And the problem we have, these skeletons, like I said, they're 7,000 years old, so a lot has taken place between then and now. Some populations merge, some populations die off, they migrate, people move around. So we don't know exactly who these people were or if they were related to historic period tribes. But the other problem we have in Florida is with the influx of Europeans, Native Americans in Florida were pretty much wiped out. We had a few remnant tribes that were, sent down to Cuba and escaped to Louisiana. But for the most part, indigenous populations in Florida were decimated when the Europeans arrived. So it's not like we have a lot of modern day Native Americans that originated here in Florida.
Right.
Tribes like the Seminole and the Timucuan, a lot of them, not the Timucuan, excuse me, but the Seminole were migrants from further up north. They were from the southeast, but they were populations that moved in as part of the Indian Removal Act and to escape removal acts from the early country. So we don't have that cultural continuity, and so no one to compare these people to. They were hoping the DNA would provide some enlightenment, and but unfortunately, because of the wet environment, the DNA was very fragmented. They have been able to isolate and identify a few of the haplogroups, and what we see from the DNA from Windover is that they did originate somewhere in Asia. As we know, all of Native Americans did. Now, when they arrived and how they got here, we simply don't know.
Well, and I find that fascinating because I'm sure you watched America Unearthed, and Hollywood can enhance the truth. But I know when Scott Waltz, I think is his name, went to the Smithsonian and talked about that DNA that they found that it was European.
Well, the problem, I think his trip to the Smithsonian and the claims that perhaps there were some European ties with Windover was more based on the artifacts. That theory that perhaps people crossed over the North Atlantic and came over from Europe that way. There are many proponents of that theory, and a lot of that is based on artifacts and stone points that look very similar to what we see over in Europe from similar time periods. But the DNA, there was a brief period when they thought they had identified haplogroups within the Windover population that were also identified in European populations. But that was part of the artifact of it being a very new science. And what we found since then is those haplogroups do not originate in Europe. They originate in Asia. They did spread eventually to Europe. But there are no European ties between Windover and between the Windover people in Europe based on DNA. So that was a misconception.
Oh, okay.
It was published at one time, but it was later refined, and those conclusions were revised.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, like I said, Hollywood can make anything look.
Yes, I noticed that when I saw that documentary.
Right.
But it does beg the question: how many gaps in history, in your line of work at least, how many times have you seen gaps in history or gaps in information where certain people put certain things in the history books or in the archaeological books, et cetera, and so forth, and then there's a lot of things that are equally as powerful as this discovery in Titusville that they just don't talk about deliberately? Do you see a lot of that?
Well, it's a problem we have anytime we're reaching back in time, trying to piece together history, and whether it's prehistory of people like Windover, or whether it's, a million-year-old history of the evolution of life, we're always going to have those gaps. So scientists do the best they can by filling in those gaps based on hard evidence. And the problem we have is a lot of people don't like to base their conclusions on hard evidence, and they'd rather use kind of fantastical stories to fill in those gaps. But those stories are not based on scientific evidence. And so it's difficult. Paleontologists, archaeologists, anybody that's trying to work with great time depth, we're always challenged, and we do the best we can. And that's why good science is always couched in the terms of this is what we think we know at this time. This is what everything is indicating. We repeat our analyses until we see repetition and reinforcement of our theories. And, we do the best we can. And so we just always try to urge people to, kind of temper their responses, because it's a difficult task. But the science we have today, we have so many incredible technologies, just like DNA analysis, that really reinforce some of the grand schemes we're starting to see play out about when people, migrated, when people evolved, all the way back to...
Ooh, I think we lost her.
Uh-oh.
Go ahead. And
I'm fascinated by every bit. I love that she said good science, and anchored in the facts, as opposed to some of the whimsical stuff that we hear about now.
Right.
And I like how she keeps us grounded in that, and then she keeps going after the physical evidence to back up the, quote, good science. I wonder if she just goes crazy this time of year as we're already starting the election season for 2016, and she hears all these people talking about things that have nothing to do with anything. It's just kind of like, well, the man upstairs told me.
That's funny. The man upstairs told me differently.
Yeah, I got me a dinosaur in my backyard.
So we're trying to get her back on line, but Eddie, do you want to say who we're chatting with?
Absolutely,
you guys.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Truth Be Told with Tony Sweet. I'm Eddie Connor.
I'm Tony Sweet.
And I'm Walt Lusk.
And today we have Dr. Rachel Wentz. She graduated from Florida State University with a PhD in anthropology, and she specializes in the analysis of human remains. She has even investigated prehistoric sites in Florida, such as Little Salt Springs and Calico Hill. Now, she's here along with her Windover publication. Rachel has also authored a book called Chasing Bones, The Mass of Men and Let Burn.
Well, I think we have her back online. Sorry we lost you there for a second.
That's quite all right.
We just reintroduced you again and told everybody out there what we're talking about. And this is fascinating. And I know when we see what we find in the stomach, we kind of know what they used to eat and stuff. But when they found the brain matter, what can brain matter tell us? Which is
especially in Florida.
Soft tissue in the archaeological record. In the case of Windover, they were really excited. I mean, no one has ever found anything like this. They, both Dorn and Dickel were astounded when they started peering into these well-preserved crania and realizing that the substance that was inside was actually brain matter. And they had high hopes of actually acquiring DNA from that soft tissue, but after 7,000 years in the pond, although some of the brain were fairly well preserved, they were unable to get DNA out of that. The DNA they extracted from Windover was actually extracted from the hard tissue, from the skeletons themselves. So, but what we can do is, we can look at this tissue. These were normal modern brains, just like yours and mine, because these were modern human beings, no different than us. So, really it just kind of stands as a testament to some of the exceptional preservation we sometimes find, rarely, in archaeological sites.
So let's go back to when you were a little girl. So whenever I was a little boy, I was playing with dinosaurs and Barbie dolls secretly, and lots of
G.I. Joe?
Yeah, and I love dinosaurs. I didn't have a G.I. Joe. I wanted one. But I wanted a Barbie, really, because I wanted somebody for G.I. Joe to hang out with. But that's another story, Walt. Thank you so much. So let's take this back to whenever you're a little girl, Dr. Wentz. So you were fascinated with dinosaurs. So take us back to when you're about under 12 years old. When did you become so passionate about what you're talking about with us today?
Well, the thing I loved about dinosaurs when I was little, and I remember the books my mother would buy me, was that I could stare at these pictures of landscapes and just try to imagine a world that was so different from the world we live in today. It boggled my mind that at one time there were no humans on the earth, that there was nothing but these extraordinary creatures living in a completely natural world. I mean, that just hooked me from the start, just trying to imagine what this world was like. And so I grew up with a passion about dinosaurs, and I really, until I was a teenager, I didn't even know what anthropology was. I grew up, the daughter of a Navy brat, so we moved around quite a bit. So I developed kind of an interest in culture at a very young age because we lived in the Philippine Islands when I was very small.
Oh, wow.
And so being immersed in this kind of foreign culture, seeing how different people lived and the foods they ate, kind of kick-started my interest in anthropology. And so when I graduated from high school, I actually started studying anthropology, but was just kind of, I was chasing it a bit, and I was young, and I wanted to get out and work. So I actually, for a time, abandoned my studies in anthropology and became a firefighter paramedic.
Oh,
and
wow.
so it launched me on a completely different path, and that's what I did for 13 years. I worked as a firefighter medic.
And that's why you wrote. Is that why you
what's
wrote?
that?
And I think you wrote two books, "Let Burn" and "The Mass of Men."
Yes, I did. Both of those books. Let Burn is based on my experience as a firefighter. I worked primarily with Orlando Fire Department and had an amazing career. I loved it. I loved working as a firefighter and a paramedic. And it was my medical studies and my medical experience as a paramedic that really gave me kind of a natural flow into bioarchaeology when I finally decided to leave the fire department and pursue a PhD. And which I did back in 2001. I left Orlando and I came up to Florida State and I got a second master's degree and went on for my PhD and took all of my medical experience that I had achieved as a medic and just put it to studying ancient disease in these ancient skeletons. So it's been kind of, a lot of people look and say, what, firefighter, paramedic turned archaeologist, there's no continuity there. But in reality, there is. Like I said, the whole medical field I just kind of had to tweak it to think in terms of life thousands of years ago instead of working on contemporary populations.
Yeah, take us back to the first time you held a 7,000-year-old bone in your hand.
Well, when I came to Florida State, I had never heard of the Windover site. I was like a lot of people had never heard of it, even though I had lived in Florida since I was a very young teenager. And so I was Glendoran's student, fortunately, which was just, has paved the way for my kind of my whole career as a bioarchaeologist. And when I started working with him and trying to kind of decide on the pathway for my studies, he said, oh, well, we have this Windover population here at Florida State. And so I came in and walked in to see these amazing skeletons, and I knew right at that moment that this is what I was destined to do. And so as I worked on my master's degree, I studied the skeletons. They were the focus of my master's thesis. And they were the reason I stayed at Florida State for my PhD, because there was so much yet to do so much work to do on these skeletons. So I continued my research looking at the types of health issues they confronted in everyday life 7,000 years ago. And it's just been a fascinating journey. And that's what I talk about. In fact, the back half of the book, Life and Death at Windover, focuses on my research, looking at what health was like for individuals living in Florida 7,000 years ago and some of the things they had to face on a daily basis.
Besides humidity.
Yeah.
Bugs.
Yeah.
Humidity and mosquitoes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And bugs.
I'm telling you.
Your other book, you have a book called Chasing Bones, I know this is one of your biggest things that you've worked on, but you don't just work on sites here in the U.S. Have you traveled abroad to different sites?
I have. I've had some really incredible experiences, and that's why I wrote the book Chasing Bones, because I've had some really great opportunities to travel around the world and do skeletal work in other parts of the world. I've done skeletal work in St. Croix. In fact, I've been there twice, working both in archaeological sites and in collections on the island. I worked at a medieval castle in northern England, which was amazing.
Wow.
The Bamborough Research Project, I got to go out and do some excavations with that project and work at a big medieval cemetery called the Bowl Hole, which just was fantastic because it was right on the shores of the North Sea, so it was just a spectacular site. And right after graduating with my PhD, I had the really unique experience of traveling with Dr. Nancy Drummond, who was a classicist at Florida State University, and we went to southern Ukraine and worked on a 2,000-year-old Scythian burial mound, which was really spectacular as well, because I really knew nothing about that region of the world or that time period, so it took a lot of hits to the library and crunching to find out who these people were. But the moment I found out that they were avid horsemen, I knew that the skeletons would probably show a lot of trauma, and I was not disappointed. There was a lot of traumatic injury on the skeletons I analyzed out in Ukraine, and it was a spectacular experience. So all of these different experiences I wanted to, share with the public, so that's why I wrote the book.
I love to hear your voice, how it's like passion and brightens, like really
Yeah.
brightens up when you talk about this stuff, and I find that so fascinating. Most people don't know that the Clovis people, that it was in New Mexico, where I think it's like 13,500 years ago is majority of the Native Americans' ancestors. Is there have you had any research that you can take and say there are some similarities to the Clovis people and the Windover people? Have you ever compared any other tribals to this site?
Well, I've compared the Windover populations to different populations that we found in Florida, but you have to remember, when we talk about Clovis people, we have very few skeletons that date back to that Clovis period.
Right.
We talk about the Clovis industry because that's based on artifacts artifacts that have been dated to a certain time period. But when we talk about skeletons of that age, it gets really tricky. We have Kennewick Man that's a little over 9,000 years old, but we have very few skeletons from that period because they just don't preserve in the soils in North America for that long. So, most of the research, that's another thing that makes Florida really unique, is because we have these wet sites, Florida accounts for the majority of ancient human remains that predate 5,000 years ago. So a lot of my work has been kind of comparing populations within Florida. So unfortunately, when we're talking about the Clovis people, we don't have a lot of people to look at, unfortunately. But, we're always...
Are there any type of weapons or hunting material that the Windover that you found?
Oh, sure. Unfortunately, there were a very small number of stone points. There were really only 5 that were recovered within the pond. And this doesn't mean they weren't using stone points. We know they were at this time period because we find stone points that predate the Windover site.
Right.
But perhaps, they just weren't interring them with the bodies. They weren't using them as grave goods. Florida doesn't have a whole abundance of really good stone resources, so they may have just been holding on to those.
Right.
But we see some fishing barbs made out of bone. There are what we think are atlatl weights, and an atlatl is used to throw a spear. It kind of is a flat rod with a little hook on the end, and in some cases they would weight that end, and you would lay a spear in it, and you could thrust that spear a lot farther with a lot more force by using an atlatl. So we think some of these items in the pond might be atlatl weights. So we can see some of the tools they were using. We have a lot of really sharp, pointy tools called awls that were made out of, animal bone and antler. We have shark's teeth that have probably been fashioned that were probably affixed to handles. So they were very creative people. I mean, they used every part of the natural landscape. And of course, then there are all the wooden implements that just haven't preserved. And that's something a lot of people forget about. We may find these beautiful stone points, but think in terms of all the technology ancient peoples probably developed that were made of wood and that just don't last in the archaeological record. So, what we're seeing is probably a very small sliver of their tools and industry.
Wow. We have about 5 minutes left, Dr. Wentz, but I wanted to ask you, I know you're beautifully steeped in science and very grounded in that way, but when you were doing some of these archaeological digs and you're in different parts of the world and you're in a castle where there was probably a lot of torture that was going on and or battlefields or burial sites, did you ever have any little yin-yang experience where the hair stood up on the back of your neck and you felt like somebody was standing there going, "Don't mess with my bones"?
I have spent so many hours and hours and hours in the Windover lab, surrounded by almost 200 dead individuals that nothing really makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck anymore. I think that instinct was pretty killed off, during my 13 years as a paramedic.
Right.
Right. Good point.
But it really, something I really do love is working on these incredible skeletons and thinking about the people they used to be, and knowing that when I hold something in my hand that this was part of a living human being, and to try to imagine what their life was like 7,000 years ago in Florida. It's a really moving experience, so I never forget the fact that these were human beings, that these were people just like me that had probably similar worries and concerns and fears and happiness. So I've been really fortunate. It's been an incredible venture working with these skeletons.
Which was going to be my next, that I was going to segue into that, but you beat me to it. That's okay.
I'm sorry.
No, it's beautiful because there is this very eloquent respect that you have and this genuine kindness that you hold when you speak about it. And so I can just imagine you surrounded by shelves and shelves of bones and that sort of thing, and how each time you're working with them, there is this great honor and respect that comes to it. Yeah. And that's a pure energy. And you sound like you've got this really excellent energy that watches over you, meaning whatever the greater part of that which we are is. And I bet you each of the beings, wherever they may be, are loving you and respecting you back as you honor their energies as well.
Well, I would hope so. Like I said, I just feel very fortunate to have come to know these people in the intimate way I have, and to try to glean some sort of aspect of what their lives were like. It's a really special thing.
Wow.
Well, we only have just a few more minutes, but go ahead, Nettie.
So your book is titled Life and Death at Windover, and it's about you sharing your findings about the 7,000-year-old archaeological site that's in Titusville, Florida. And where can we get this book, Dr. Wentz?
You can order all my books on Amazon. They're all there. You can also visit my website at rachelwentzbooks.com and learn more about my background and about the books themselves. And of course, I have a Facebook page and everything else that goes along with it. But all the books are available on Amazon.
And for the people that maybe want to take a trip down to Florida and stop by, what can they expect? Because it sounds like it's not no huge park or anything. It sounds like it's a smaller little area. But what can people expect, or can they even get close enough to see the pond or the bog?
Jurassic Windover.
Well, the site isn't really open to visitors, unfortunately. There is a small museum in Cocoa, the Brevard Museum of History and Science, that has a small Windover display where you can go and visit and learn more about the site. And aside from my book that is written for the general population, if you want kind of a more intensive, Dr. Glenn Dorn has put together an edited volume on Windover, which is also available on Amazon. Now, it's much more technical and has all of the heavy science involved, but it's truly a an incredible kind of congregation of the scientific literature about Windover.
Well, Dr. Rachel Wentz, we want to thank you so much for being here. You were great.
And thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
And we hope to have you back sometime, and please keep in touch. And definitely, if anybody out there listening to us or watching us, you can watch this on YouTube, or you can check all of our podcasts out on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn. And we'd love to have you guys take a listen to this and learn as much as we've learned today. And we want to appreciate Dr. Rachel Wentz. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
All right, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Have a good day. And so I have to say that she's fascinating, and I love her passion. Like you said,
absolutely.
Every time she would talk about certain things, you could just see her light up.
Reverence as well.
And that's one reason when I saw this on television, I thought, wow, I've never heard of this. And we hear about the Native Americans in the Southwest, but we never really hear a lot about in that area, especially in Florida. So I thought that's one reason I think it was important to bring it to all of our listeners and viewers to attention. So, all right. So, anything you have to say about Dr. Wentz?
I just thought she was fascinating. Where I think we're all in agreement. I'm fascinated. I'm using that adjective way too much.
Fascinated.
Fascinated.
Fascinating.
I really appreciate how she takes good care of the bones that she's working with and the sites that she goes to. I find that sometimes people who are super scientific have a tendency not to see it as anything but a physical thing, and you can tell she takes great reverence in it, and that's something you don't see a lot. So I like the balance between that respect and honoring what she's doing and then treating it like something she loves and appreciates. It just makes me feel happy.
No, people like that. And if it wasn't for people like that, a lot of our world history would not ever be known.
That's true.
So we want to thank her. All right, so we want you to go take a quick break.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned because we have another great guest on.
We're going to Egypt.
Yeah, Egypt and Lebanon.
Lebanon.
We have Stephen Mailer going to be calling in, Skyping in actually, and talking about new finds that he won on his recent tour. So
don't leave town.
Don't leave town. Well, you can leave town, but always take us with you.
That's it.
All right. Truth be told with Tony Sweet. I'm Tony Sweet.
I'm Eddie Connor.
And I'm Walt Lusk.
We'll be right back.
Thanks.
Take what inspires you and turn it into a one-of-a-kind outdoor living space with AZEK deck trim and pavers. Whether you dream of a luxurious place to entertain or the timeless elegance of craftsmanship and curb appeal, AZEK's suite of low-maintenance building products allows you to refine your home with durable, lasting beauty. AZEK building products, designed to last beautifully.